3 days ago, Jonathan Roumie was sitting in a corner booth at a small café in Boston, trying to disappear into his coffee and his thoughts, when a blind girl, no older than 9, stopped directly in front of his table. She tilted her head, listening to something he couldn't hear. Then she whispered 7 words that made his blood run cold. "Your heartbeat sounds like Jesus' voice." What she said next, he was still trying to process, and when doctors discovered what they did about her condition 2 hours later, he understood why he hadn't been able to sleep since. The morning had started unremarkably. Jonathan had flown into Boston for a single day of press interviews promoting the new season of The Chosen, and he had exactly 90 minutes between his last interview and his flight back to Los Angeles. He didn't want to go back to the hotel. He didn't want to sit in the terminal. He wanted to be alone, anonymous, just another face in a city that didn't know him. So he pulled up his hood, put on his sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and walked 3 blocks until he found a café that looked sufficiently unremarkable, the kind of place where nobody would recognize him, where he could just be Jonathan for an hour. The café was moderately crowded with the usual mid-afternoon mixture of remote workers hunched over laptops, elderly couples sharing pastries, and college students pretending to study while scrolling through their phones. Jonathan ordered a black coffee and found a corner booth near the back, as far from the front door as possible. He slid into the worn leather seat and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For the past 6 weeks, he had been on a relentless promotional tour, doing the same interviews, answering the same questions, smiling the same smile. He loved the work. He loved what The Chosen meant to people, but sometimes the weight of portraying Jesus felt heavier than the role itself. Sometimes he wondered if he was enough, if his faith was strong enough, if he was worthy of the responsibility. He had been sitting there for perhaps 15 minutes, lost in these thoughts when he first noticed her. A young girl with long auburn hair, moving through the café with a white cane that tapped gently against chair legs and table corners. She wore a simple yellow dress and white sneakers, and her movements had a practiced quality that suggested she'd been navigating the world without sight for a very long time. Her mother walked a few steps behind her, close enough to intervene, if necessary, but far enough to let the girl maintain her independence. Jonathan watched them order at the counter, watched the barista hand the mother 2 drinks while speaking directly to the child, treating her with the casual respect that suggested they were regulars here. What happened next would replay in Jonathan's mind 1,000 times over the following days, each repetition revealing new details he hadn't noticed in the moment. The girl had been walking back toward a table near the window where her mother was waiting, carefully counting her steps, when she suddenly stopped. Just stopped, in the middle of the café, her cane frozen mid-tap. Her head tilted slightly to the left, the way a dog tilts its head when hearing a sound beyond human frequency. And then, slowly, deliberately, she turned in Jonathan's direction. He felt something shift in the air. He couldn't explain it then, and he couldn't explain it now, but in that moment, every sound in the café seemed to fade into a muffled background hum. The espresso machine, the conversations, the music playing through overhead speakers, all of it became distant and unimportant. The girl took 3 steps toward his booth, then 3 more. Her mother called out to her, confused, but the girl didn't respond. She walked with absolute certainty, no longer using her cane to search for obstacles, moving as though she could see exactly where she was going. She stopped directly in front of Jonathan's table. Her eyes, a striking pale blue, were pointed in, his general direction but focused on nothing, the telltale sign of profound blindness. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds, her head still tilted, listening. And then she did something that made Jonathan's breath catch in his throat. She placed her right hand flat on the table, fingers spread wide, and slowly slid it across the surface until her fingertips touched his left hand, which had been resting near his coffee cup. The touch was gentle, almost reverent. Her hand was small and warm, and when her fingers made contact with his, he felt a jolt of something he couldn't name. Not electricity, not fear, something closer to recognition. She traced her fingers up his forearm to his wrist, finding his pulse point. She pressed 2 fingers there, counting, measuring. Her face was absolutely serene, showing no fear or uncertainty. After a moment, she moved her hand to his chest, placing her palm flat against his sternum, right over his heart. Jonathan didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. He was aware of the girl's mother rushing over, apologizing, but the words seemed to come from very far away. The girl kept her hand on his chest, and he could feel his own heartbeat against her palm, steady and strong. She was counting again, he realized, counting the beats, listening to the rhythm. And then she leaned in close, so close that he could smell the strawberry shampoo in her hair, and she whispered those 7 words that would haunt him. "Your heartbeat sounds like Jesus' voice." The cafe didn't stop. The world didn't freeze. But for Jonathan, time became elastic and strange. He stared at this blind child who had somehow recognized something in him that he wasn't sure was even there. The girl's mother finally reached them, flustered and apologetic, pulling gently at her daughter's arm. Jonathan found his voice barely. "It's okay, she's fine." The mother looked mortified. "I'm so sorry, Emma sometimes does this. She hears things differently than other people. She doesn't mean to bother you." But Emma wasn't done. She pulled away from her mother's grip with surprising strength and leaned even closer to Jonathan, her blind eyes now inches from his face. Her next words came out in a whisper so soft that only he could hear them. "He wants you to know that you're exactly where you're supposed to be, and that the doubt you carry isn't a weakness. It's the thing that makes you real." Jonathan's vision blurred. He felt tears burning at the corners of his eyes, tears he didn't fully understand. How could this child know about the doubt? How could she know about the questions that kept him awake at night, the fear that he wasn't good enough, that his portrayal of Jesus was somehow a lie because his own faith felt so fragile sometimes? The mother succeeded in pulling Emma back this time, still apologizing profusely, and Jonathan could only nod mutely, unable to form words. As Emma was led away, she turned back once more. Her face pointed in his direction with impossible accuracy, and she said one final thing that he would carry with him forever. "Your heart remembers what your mind forgets. Keep listening to it." And then she was gone, back to her table by the window, back to her hot chocolate and her mother's worried whispers. Jonathan sat frozen in his booth, his coffee forgotten, his mind racing through what had just happened. He looked down at his chest where Emma's hand had been, half expecting to see some mark, some evidence of the encounter. There was nothing, just his own hand trembling slightly as he pressed it against his sternum, feeling his heartbeat, wondering what she had heard. He sat there for another 20 minutes, unable to move, unable to process what had occurred. He watched Emma and her mother from across the cafe. The girl seemed perfectly normal now, sipping her drink, tilting her head occasionally as she listened to her mother's voice. But there was something about her stillness, her absolute peace, that suggested she was not like other children. That she existed in a reality slightly different from everyone else's. Eventually, Jonathan knew he had to leave or risk missing his flight. But before he did, he made a decision that surprised him. He walked over to Emma's table. The mother looked up with a mixture of wariness and embarrassment, but Jonathan smiled, a real smile, not his practiced one. "Excuse me, I'm sorry to intrude, but I wanted to ask about Emma, what she did, what she said. Has that happened before?" The mother hesitated, clearly trying to decide how much to reveal to a stranger. Finally, she sighed. "Emma has a condition. It's called synesthesia, but not the common kind. Her neurologist calls it cross-modal synesthesia. She can't see, but somehow her brain compensates by translating other sensory information in unusual ways. She says she can hear colors, she can feel sounds, and heartbeats. She claims she can hear heartbeats from across a room and they all sound different to her, like voices." Jonathan felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "And she recognized mine? My heartbeat?" The mother nodded slowly. "She said your heartbeat sounded like someone she's heard before. In her dreams, she says. She has these dreams where someone talks to her, someone she can't see but whose voice she recognizes. And she says that voice sounds like your heartbeat." Jonathan knelt down beside the table so he was at Emma's level. The girl turned toward him with that same uncanny precision, as if she could see him perfectly. He spoke softly, carefully. Emma, can I ask you something? When you heard my heartbeat, what exactly did it sound like? Emma tilted her head, considering. When she spoke, her voice had a dreamy, distant quality. It sounds like home, like being safe, like when you're scared, but then you remember that everything is going to be okay. That's what Jesus sounds like in my dreams, and that's what your heart sounds like. Jonathan felt something break open inside his chest, some wall he hadn't even known he'd built. He reached out and gently touched Emma's hand. Thank you. You don't know how much I needed to hear that today. Emma smiled, a pure, radiant smile that transformed her entire face. He told me I would meet you. He told me you would need to remember. Remember what? That you're loved. Not because you're perfect, but because you're you. Jonathan left the cafe 10 minutes later, his mind spinning, his heart pounding in his chest with a rhythm he was suddenly hyper-aware of. He made it to the airport in a daze, checked in mechanically, sat at his gate staring at nothing. The words kept echoing in his mind. Your heartbeat sounds like Jesus' voice. You're loved not because you're perfect, but because you're you. Keep listening to your heart. It remembers what your mind forgets. On the plane, he couldn't sleep despite his exhaustion. He kept replaying the encounter, kept trying to understand what had happened. Was it really possible that this blind child had somehow heard something in his heartbeat that connected to her dreams? That she had recognized him not by sight or sound or even touch, but by some deeper sensory translation that science barely understood. When he landed in Los Angeles 3 hours later, he immediately searched for information about Emma's condition. He found articles about synesthesia, about how some people could taste words or see music as colors. But cross-modal synesthesia in the blind was far rarer. He found case studies of blind individuals who developed heightened abilities in their remaining senses, but nothing quite like what Emma had described. Nothing about hearing heartbeats as voices. Nothing about dreams where Jesus spoke in rhythms and pulses. He couldn't let it go. The next morning, still jet-lagged and disoriented, he called the cafe in Boston. He asked if they knew the regular customer, the blind girl who came in with her mother. They did. They gave him the mother's contact information with her permission, explaining that she had actually asked them to pass it along if the man from yesterday called. She had known he would call. Jonathan spoke with Emma's mother, Sarah, for over an hour. She told him Emma's story. Born 3 months premature with her optic nerves underdeveloped, Emma had never seen light, never seen her mother's face, never seen colors or shapes or anything that sighted people took for granted. But from a very young age, she had talked about hearing things that others couldn't hear. She would point to a red wall and say it sounded like a trumpet. She would touch a blue blanket and say it felt like rain sounded. Her parents had taken her to neurologists, to specialists, to researchers studying rare sensory conditions. The diagnosis had come when Emma was 6. Her brain, deprived of visual input, had rewired itself in extraordinary ways. The regions that should have processed sight had been colonized by her auditory cortex and her somatosensory cortex, creating unprecedented crosstalk between sensory systems. She could hear things that shouldn't make sound. She could feel things that shouldn't have texture. And somehow, inexplicably, she could detect and interpret heartbeats from a distance, translating their rhythms into something her mind processed as voices or presences. But that wasn't the most remarkable part of Emma's story. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper when she told Jonathan about Emma's dreams. For the past 3 years, Emma had been having recurring dreams about someone she simply called the kind man. She couldn't see him in her dreams, obviously, but she could hear him. Not his voice in the traditional sense, but his presence, which she described as sounding like a heartbeat that felt warm and safe and loving. She would wake up from these dreams and tell her mother that the kind man had talked to her about being brave, about not being afraid of her darkness, about how everyone had their own kind of darkness, and that was okay. Sarah had assumed these dreams were Emma's way of processing her disability, of creating an imaginary friend to help her cope with a world she couldn't see. But then Emma had walked into that cafe 3 days ago, had stopped dead in the middle of the room, and had said something that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Mommy, the kind man from my dreams is here." And she had walked straight to Jonathan's table with absolute certainty. Sarah asked Jonathan a question that he couldn't answer. "Have you ever met Emma before? Is there any way she could have heard your voice from The Chosen?" Jonathan had thought about this. Emma couldn't have recognized his voice because he hadn't spoken before she approached him. And The Chosen, while popular, wasn't the kind of show that 9-year-old girls typically watched. But more than that, what Emma had recognized wasn't his voice at all. It was his heartbeat. The physical rhythm of his cardiovascular system translated through some neurological miracle into a sound that matched the presence in her dreams. "No," he told Sarah. "We've never met. I don't think she's ever heard my voice or anything I've been in." There was a long pause on the line. Then Sarah said something that sent chills down Jonathan's spine. "2 hours after you left the cafe, I took Emma to see her neurologist. Dr. Reeves has been treating her since she was 6. I told him what happened, and he wanted to run some tests. He did an fMRI while playing Emma recordings of different heartbeats, different rhythms, different rates, different people. And Jonathan, when they played her a recording of a heartbeat similar to what yours would be, certain areas of her brain lit up like a Christmas tree. Areas that normally process recognition of loved ones. Areas associated with feelings of safety and peace. Her brain was responding to that heartbeat rhythm as if it were the voice of someone she knew and trusted completely." Jonathan didn't know what to say. The scientific explanation only made the mystery deeper. What does Dr. Reeves think is happening? He thinks Emma's brain has created an association between a specific heartbeat rhythm and her psychological need for comfort and guidance. He thinks the dreams are her subconscious creating a protector figure, and that protector happens to have a heartbeat signature similar to yours. But here's what he can't explain. How did Emma know you would be in that cafe? How did she recognize your specific heartbeat from across a crowded room when she'd never heard it before except in dreams? He called it a 1 in several billion coincidence. But Jonathan didn't believe in coincidences anymore. Not after 6 years of playing Jesus. Not after hearing thousands of stories from people whose lives had been changed in ways that defied rational explanation. Not after experiencing his own moments of inexplicable grace and divine timing. He asked Sarah if he could visit Emma again. She said yes, that Emma had been asking about him every day, wanting to know if he would come back. So Jonathan flew back to Boston the following weekend, cleared his schedule, and met Emma and her mother at a park near their home. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and Emma sat on a bench next to him, her hand resting lightly on his wrist, feeling his pulse. They talked for 2 hours. Emma told him about her dreams, about how the kind man in her dreams had told her that she was going to meet someone important, someone who needed to remember something he had forgotten. She described the way the kind man's heartbeat sounded to her, like waves on a shore, like a lullaby, like safety itself. And then she asked Jonathan a question that nearly broke him. "Do you play Jesus? My mom said you play Jesus on TV." Jonathan nodded, then remembered she couldn't see. "Yes, I do," Emma smiled. "That's good, because you already know how. Your heart already knows. That's why it sounds the way it does." He asked her what she meant, and Emma explained in the simple, profound way that children sometimes can. "Jesus' heart must have been very kind. Kind hearts sound different. They sound like they have room for everyone. Your heart sounds like that. Like it has room." Jonathan thought about this later, on the plane back to Los Angeles, staring out the window at clouds that looked like continents. He thought about all the times he had doubted himself, all the times he had wondered if he was worthy of the role, if his faith was strong enough, if he was enough. And he thought about a 9-year-old blind girl who had heard something in his heartbeat that he couldn't hear himself, something that told her he was safe, that told her he had room in his heart for everyone. Maybe that was the message. Maybe that was what Emma had been sent to tell him, if such things could be believed. That faith wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about having all the answers or never doubting. It was about having a heart with room. Room for questions, room for weakness, room for others, room for love, even when it felt scary or uncertain. 3 weeks later, Jonathan received a package in the mail. Inside was a drawing that Emma had made for him. Of course, being blind, she couldn't draw in the traditional sense, but she had created a tactile artwork using different textures of fabric, glued to a canvas in abstract patterns. Sarah had included a note explaining that Emma had spent hours on this, carefully selecting each texture based on how it felt to her fingers. The arrangement of fabrics created a pattern that Emma said represented what Jonathan's heartbeat looked like to her inner senses. Jonathan hung the artwork in his home office, right next to his desk where he studied scripts and prepared for filming. He looked at it often, running his fingers over the different textures, trying to understand how Emma perceived the world, trying to hear what she heard, trying to remember what his heart apparently hadn't forgotten. The encounter in that Boston cafe changed something fundamental in Jonathan. He still had doubts. He still had questions. He still had nights when the weight of portraying Jesus felt too heavy for mortal shoulders. But now, when those moments came, he would place his hand over his heart and feel it beating, steady and sure. And he would remember Emma's words. Your heartbeat sounds like Jesus' voice. Your heart remembers what your mind forgets. Keep listening to it. And he would remember that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to be perfect. He just had to have a heart with room. Room for doubt and faith. Room for strength and weakness. Room for everyone who needed to hear that they were loved, not because they were perfect, but because they were themselves. And if a blind 9-year-old girl could hear that in his heartbeat from across a crowded room, then perhaps it was true. Perhaps it had been true all along.